thank you guys for having me today. The day's close to over. I apologize if I have a little rasp in my voice. It's my 4th hour talking. But my background is I actually started an external audit. I was there only for about 2 years before I moved to financial consulting. The entire time focused on banking and mortgage servicing industry, mainly one large client. My current role, I do a lot of ASC 31030 modeling, structured products modeling, including CMBS and ABS, and different loan valuation modeling. Also, I am a chartered financial analyst charter holder and a certified public accountant in the state of Illinois. So on the agenda for today, we'll start out kind of explaining what is expected loss modeling. We really just want to define it. It's going to sound basic, but to really get an understanding of how to do modeling, you really need to understand what it is. And then from there, we're going to expand on Graham's earlier discussion this morning about different modeling methodologies, and we'll dig in deeper into the cohort approach, vintage analysis, and much deeper into probabilistic methodologies. Throughout this time, I'll share some of my experiences, different models I've developed, different models I've seen, and see what I think works best in my own opinions. Within those modeling methodologies, we'll kind of keep out the correlation and adjustment factors until its own section. So just so you know, don't be wondering why we're not putting them in right there. They'll come later. We're going to talk about the selection of factors, evaluation of the strengths of correlations, understanding and dealing with nonlinear correlations, and then the application of these factors. Then finally, we'll just round off the presentation with transitioning, really get into what do you got to do to prepare your governance structure and model validation. Now, this is a small group workshop, so one of the things I want to make sure I address what questions you guys might have. So coming into this, is there anything that you guys want me to focus on a little more attention, a little less attention, or is there any expectations set and balance that I could provide a little additional commentary? All right. Well, just chime in as you will. Have any questions? The other sessions that had more questions were a little more interesting, and I think they got more out of it, and we got to talk through real life examples. So, if you don't understand something, probably I'll explain it. Enough people don't either. So what is expected loss modeling? Expected loss modeling can be broken down into 2 different things. First, expected losses. And as you've probably seen defined 100 times now, it's expected credit losses, which are current estimate of all contractual cash flows not expected to be collected. And then you have the modeling aspect of it. The model is a set of ideas and numbers that describe the past, present, future state of something. And so, a model is not just generalized to, an Excel workbook with formulas or a SAS model or anything else that you might construct as a model. Models are part of everyday life. We wake up in the morning and we know what kind of clothes to wear by a weather forecast model. And, then our drive to work, we know where the best route due to our GPS has a route modeling aspect to it. So, what we're going to focus is on how, this set of ideas and principles can be really applied to understanding expected credit losses, though. Modeling methodologies. Graham gave a brief overview, and my goal here is a little dive in a little further and make sure you guys actually have a good understanding of what each of these methodologies entails, how to perform it, common mishaps, and since we're a few years down the road before we actually are needing to do the CECL models, what you guys can do starting today. To refresh your memory from this morning, the cohort methodology takes groups of loans that are of the same risk rating and loan type and other common risk characteristics and aggregates them into a current cohort. They then use this cohort as a static pool to track future losses. However, and I think this is probably the most confusing part of the cohort methodology, each subsequent period, the loan stays in that static pool, but also creates a new static pool. Does that make sense to everyone, or is that something else? Yes.
So basically, say, simple, 0 to 30 days delinquent, and one in that quarter. And then you will have another static pool of 30 days delinquent that starts on the next quarter.
Correct.
Right? So every period, and every period starts a new static pool.
That's exactly right.
And the idea is to get an average of them, sort of, yes, we'll say.
Well, an
performance.
And the other key factor to that, that's exactly right, it's not only the average of those different static pools, but you also, at the end of the quarter or your reporting period, you have loans that are all over the place. You know, using your example, you have loans that are in different delinquency pools, and so you need different cohorts for those pools to be applied.
Right.
So that's a perfect example. I think. Oh yes.
On the topic of cohorts, in perfect world, if you take your loans from origination to maturity and track what happens to them, and then you determine the loss rate. So you create a pool at, let's say, a point in time.
Yep.
And you track things all the way through. See what the loss rate on that pool is. The part I'm confused on is now your second period, loans that came out of that part of the status pool, because now you're gonna put them in a new pool as well.
Yeah.
So now, what was in that pool to start out with? Brand new loans that are now substandard.
That's a great question, actually. And so think about this. I mean, you start brand new bank to Nova Charter, you're not going to be originating substandard loans. At least I hope you wouldn't be. And so you don't have any cohort for that substandard yet. And so one of the things to note, you know, if your loan was originally in period 1, and you know, it stayed in each of these static pools, and this diagram is just for pass rated, and let's say period 6, it goes to substandard, and then move to your substandard. Well, your substandard pool, or your loss cycle, is going to be much shorter because you missed the first half of that loan when it was in the pass pool. So that's a good point. You won't originally have data to present there until you build that data. You won't be able to apply loss rates. So, you know, hopefully, with everyone, if everyone's collecting historical losses, which I'm sure they're doing for their current pass 5 allowance, if they have the static pool ability to look back, we'll kind of talk back into transitioning, where you know where your loans were risk rated in the past, and you've been able to track that. That's something you can set up. Now, I know not all the systems support static pool tracking, so get into that, but that might be something you can start today, so that in a few years you'll be ready to track it. Yes.
I just had a question for everybody here. I'm wondering how many banks monitor that progression, whether it's pass, we'll say special mention, substandard. If you could get the history of that on your loans today, as opposed to just the last thing that's rated now, I guess we'll say. Is that pretty commonly monitored? I've gotten some mixed.
I would say my experience is less than half to go back historically. What I asked was, can you guys raise your hands? How many could look at historical point in time what the risk rating was? So then you'd be very well set up if you're already getting migration analysis.
Right.
So it looked a little over than half. So I think that's something to think about if in that half that doesn't have, you know, a historical look back to that, because this might be a methodology that's gonna be a little more tucked in. So, to get back to where we were saying, you know, once you have each cohort's loss accumulation period and understanding the different losses that occur in these purple bars, you could then take either a weighted average or a simple average and come up with a life of loan loss rate. Multiple different methodologies to do it, and the important part is just make sure, you know, it captures an entire life cycle of a loan and preferably a business cycle of a loan. And then, you know, I like to skip to this chart because I think this has a lot better explanation and understanding here. So, you know, when you're calculating your allowance, you know, we calculated expected loss rates in each cohort, based on how the loan migrated and then eventually went to loss. And when you're calculating your allowance, the only thing you really need from here is your ending balance and your loss rate, just by multiplying the two. Remember, I'm leaving out adjustment factors for now. But just by multiplying the two, you get your estimated credit loss. What I think is interesting about here, that always gets questioned is, so as you get a new origination, where does the loan go? Well, the loan still stays in the same category, and it will be part of the new cohort of past category 2 loans for that period, and it will be part of the past category 2 loans every subsequent period until part of that loan pays off, or the loan migrates from past category 2 to some subsequent past category, and then if that loan migrates down to special mention and then in the next period it falls off the board with a charge-off, that charge-off will then actually go into the future expected loss rates for all of these different categories. And that's something that I think is kind of a confusing aspect, because most people say, well, aren't you capturing the same expected loss, or the same loss event 3 different times? And you know, my response was, no, it's not really like you're capturing it 3 different times, because you're capturing it once as a 2 loan out of all the 2 loans that came through this portfolio, category 2 loans that came through this portfolio. Only 50 basis points of them resulted in loss. Well, you know, that same 50 basis point at some point migrated over to a category 4. All the ones that were in the category 4 category, 300 basis points. And so it's not double counting then, because when you actually do your allowance calculation, your ending balance isn't in multiple categories. Your ending balance is only in one of these categories, and depending on the risk category of it currently, that's what your expected loss amount, life of loan loss amount gets applied. So kind of went through a lot right there. Is everyone on board on the application of the cohort approach? Yes.
So this looks very similar to migration analysis that you would do, you know, one of the methodologies that you use today. Is it much different than that?
No, and actually conceptually, it's extremely similar. If you have a good understanding of how the migration analysis works, it's very easy to catch on to this. The difference is migration analysis will track, you know, your migration from one loan level to another loan level, or one risk rating to another risk rating. This is essentially a binary migration analysis that only tracks risk rating to loss. And so instead of reporting the percentage that went from one risk rating to another, you're reporting essentially the percentage of loss. So, but they, honestly, the exact same concepts. If you're already doing a migration analysis, you probably, in almost all circumstances, you probably have the data to do this. And so you might actually, with that, be able to do a little more complex analysis, or even add-on tests. This was a very simple example, but there's a lot of other things you could do if you're already at that position. Any other questions on my cohort approach? Yes.
Just coming up with those cohorts, is there a time frame where you're coming up with these loss ratios? I mean, does it have to coincide with your normal FAS 5 historical look back, or can you use, let's say, 5 years for this and 3 years for your FAS 5, or do they have to be in, I guess the question, do they have to be in sync?
So it would not be in sync with your FAS 5. It needs to be in sync with the product that you're having in this portfolio. So if these are usually, 7-year auto loans, you should probably have roughly a 7-year look back period. And so you want to match, because remember, this is for the CECL model, this is the life of the loan, whereas the FAS 5 is just incurred today. So your look back period is going to at least go through one loan life cycle. I don't think it's reasonable for residential mortgages to have a 30-year look back, because I think, at least right now, with prepayments, they're averaging a little over 7 years, and that might go up in the next couple of years a little bit, but you kind of want to at least get to a point where you have a majority of these portfolio running out.
I didn't ask the question after I thought about it. We've historically done, or we use a 3-year look back period for our FAS 5. And we know that our substandard loans have always been, are gonna have a lot more risk than your normal pass grade loan. So we were taking a multiple of our historical times these substandard loans and saying that's what the reserve we needed on those. Well, the last year or so, we've kind of got some pushback. We needed to kind of prove that the number we were using was correct.
Yeah.
So we went back and did this for those substandard loans, where we're coming up with this, but we're still using like historical on the pass graded loans, and we're just using this on the substandard. And so my question, I guess, do those two things need to be in sync? So I guess we're using kind of a combination, but we kind of arrived at it because we kind of had to, or we've got pushback where we had to document why we're using a multiple of our historical. How do we know that that's really our true experience and not we just came up with this number?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding you correctly, for your FAS 5 right now, you're using the multiple, the historical, to get what you think's incurred. And I think that becomes less relevant in the CECL model, because you're not only aggregating the incurred losses, but you're aggregating the rest of the losses in the future. So rather than have any type of multiple, your look back period, instead of using a 3-year, would be far enough extended back to encapsulate all losses that could occur. Is that not?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, right now we're using, I think 4.5 years or 4 years for our substandard loans for this cohort, and we're still using just 3% or 3 years on our FAS 5. And we've just kind of started it, so I'm just trying to anticipate if we're going to get any kind of pushback from our auditors.
I think you, depending on what type of loans you have, I think you're probably 3 or 4 years is probably a bit short for these. Unless you're using
for the substandard.
They actually probably fit the substandard better than the performing. And the reason why is that, a performing loan typically have a whole life cycle in their static cohort. So from origination all the way through either maturity, prepayment, or default. Any other loan is going to have, they're going to miss those first few months in which the borrower deteriorates and comes into one of the other cohorts. So, substandard, special mention, is essentially always gonna be shorter than your performing cohorts. And so that's, I think, for your performing cohorts, you actually gotta have a longer time frame, if that makes sense. So. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Just based on, presuming these are just random numbers you can carry.
Yeah. This is
Otherwise, your 50 basis points wouldn't tie in with the size for special mention.
Yeah. Oh, because it's not mathematically possible, isn't it?
Well, you find such a low loss ratio on the left, if you're gonna have that much on the right.
Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, this is actually from this is copied out of the CECL proposal. But yeah, it doesn't make sense. Well, actually, and one of the things, just to make sure we're on the same page, you know, what you don't see on this chart is the loans that have gone into loss. So in theory, you know, this is a partial charge off, you know, this 50 basis points doesn't increase when they move over to special mention. It only increases when there's actual loss event. And that's one of the biggest differentiations between this and the migration analysis.
But they're in the first cohort.
And they'll stay in that first cohort, but unless they actually hit loss, they won't move over.
They won't move over till what?
They won't, or sorry, I shouldn't say move over, they won't be included in that expected loss rates.
Right.
So if you have a loan that moves to a special mention, you know, in separate periods now, they're in different cohorts, but unless that loss event occurs, that will not adjust your expected loss rate.
But I thought it stays in that cohort until you're done with the loan.
It is, and
So
so,
then at some point, assuming that you do incur the loss, at some point that loss is gonna be in that first cohort.
oh yeah, if you do incur a loss.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay. Yeah, we're good. Think we're on the same page now?
I don't know, I mean, you're gonna, just say the loss is gonna happen.
Yeah.
You started in loss category 2. At some point when that loss happens, it's gonna be part of that cohort.
Yes.
And then at later stage, you lose to category 4, that same loss is gonna be in category 4.
Yes.
And same special mention, that's the same loss.
That's correct.
So then you should have those losses. You said you don't have them.
Oh, so I was meaning if it got to special mention, let's say there was not a loss event, it paid out, you would never have an adjustment to the
You have to have
expected
the loss to have it, and then it's every big
Yeah.
cover.
You would have the migration, the credit migration, but you'd never actually have your expected loss rates adjusted. So the next approach is modeling expected losses on vintage. And so one of the questions that was asked this morning of Graham was, what approach do you recommend and why? And the guidance doesn't really give any definitive of what approach is best to use, and it really matters in your portfolio, but I do have some opinions on, just from my experience, which works better. When you start thinking about it, vintage is highly successful when you have high volume, low collateral value, and low differentiation and balance loans. So consumer unsecured, auto loans, those kind of loans that you have high volume coming through, that usually works successfully in a vintage model. Going back to the cohort model, when you have CREs or some other kind of loan that it undergoes loan reviews and the risk rating is updated timely, that usually works more on the cohort balance. And so just an example, think of a consumer loan that doesn't get a risk rating. It just goes from essentially nothing in their past to charge off. That's not really gonna work in your cohort model. And so that's why the vintage model is so good. So the same thing, just as some of the policies of your bank that you work at, If you guys if you feel really comfortable about the loan review procedures and adequately have a good master risk rating scale that you feel is well defined and well understood throughout the entity, then it lends it into the cohort approach working well. And so for the vintage approach, the idea is to track homogeneous loans on the basis of a calendar year, quarter, or monthly. I will, calendar year is an option, but I will say I would highly not recommend doing it. Part of the work in this is building the model to begin with, is aggregating the data. If you got all the data aggregated, you might as well go monthly. You get the most descriptive out of this, and you have a better understanding about your portfolio. And with this, as we can see here, there's a few years. This is an example I was put together on, a 4-year life product. It's non-amortizing, and so you have two full life loan cycles, 2010-11, and what these annual loss rates do is create an annual loss curve for these loans. So with the annual loss curve, there's actually many different methodologies to extrapolating it. And one of the ways you can do it is extrapolate it out to the different year 3 and 4, and then add on your adjustment factors after the fact, or you could mathematically take that curve and build in your adjustment factors based on different correlations we'll go over. So there's a few different options on how you want to apply this, but the real goal is to use mathematical derivation to essentially fill in the purple cells here. With that in mind, there's a few things to be mindful of when you start applying this. Outside of the purple cells is activity that's already occurred. You don't need to reserve for this. So as your loans are seasoned further, you only need to allow or build an allowance in for the total expected losses in the purple cells. So as you'll see in 2012, they're already more well seasoned. You're gonna have a smaller loss rate. And realistically looking at it on a non-amortizing loan, that probably wouldn't look that shape of a loss curve, for example, stakes. This probably looks more like an amortizing loans where there's less of a balance in year 4. So, what you have here in the remaining expected loss is just the sum of the purple cells. And these are, I think in this example, I adjusted them for economic factors, that I kind of pulled out the different section of the presentation. And so those are adjusted, and then you can apply based on that to the balance that's left in the portfolio. So this is how, it's very simple. Just apply the expected loss rate to your balance sheet amount. If you identify adjustment factors, you can overlay them here also. And then, before we move on, any questions on the vintage method? I'll move there a little quickly. I think a lot of people with consumer loans are more familiar with that. So, probability methodology is either using quantitative methods to statistically determine a probability of default, which is the likelihood that a loan will have a default at a given time, over a given time horizon. For the CECL model, that time horizon is the life of the loan. In other models, they use 1 year, 5 year, 2 years. But for CECL, it's going to be matching with the life of the loan. Default is a loss event that occurs, not necessarily, it's good to separate out things like administrative defaults under the PD-LGD model. Administrative defaults are basically true defaults. And a loss given default is exactly what it sounds like. It's the amount of loss that occurs when you have a default. It's the amount that will not be recovered. An exposure at default, this has several meanings, and kind of just talk through it from a high level. There's a question came up this morning, okay, what about if we have a rolling line, or a line of credit, or, you know, unfunded commitments? How do you know the exposure at the time of the default? And there's a few different techniques. Typically with line of credits and unfunded lines, there's statistical modeling that, given historical analysis of, you know, how your portfolio reacted when it came close to default, that could make an estimate. I'll tell you, three of them is probably the least precise estimate, and like we said, because you're estimating human behavior using statistics. But they take into consideration different factors. You know, what is your draw procedures? What are your borrowing-based procedures? How quickly are you going to recover the draws in the past prior to default? On the other hand, it's, you know, typical that you always see that spike in draws just prior to a default as a borrower is struggling for money. So that's a bit of a challenging one to calculate. The other way to calculate exposure at default is if you have reliable amortization schedules. Anyone that does ASC 310-30 is probably familiar in some kind of respect of applying a probability of default or a converted probability of default and loss given default to a cash flow model used for ASC 310-30. This just estimates different probability factors each month on given contractually scheduled payment streams. That methodology is a little more reliable. One of the questions that actually came up earlier about that is, you know, what do you see as the precision level in PD and LGD? And you know, the comment made is PD is pretty much always wrong when looked at individually. I've actually never seen it be right. And the reason for is if you apply probability of default on an individual loan basis, I'm talking the cash flow method, you're saying that each month there's a monthly factor of default based on the probability. Well, it's very unlikely that your borrower is just going to default, you know, $15 or $40 every month. It's either a one-time event or not. So probability default in the aggregate could be a very powerful tool, but it's very, I wouldn't say useless, but not that strong on its own. LGD, there's what I like to classify when I'm talking about LGD, two different types of borrowers, and I think this has an impact on the precision, and that's asset heavy and asset light. An asset light borrower, I consider, you know, consulting firm. Their assets are desks, computers, and chairs. Items that when you go to repossess, they have a lot of variability, and there's a lot of unknown on what you actually get out of that. Asset heavy are things, you know, single asset hotels, and nice piece of hotels. So that's an asset heavy that, you know, you get more reliable cash flows to receive. Then your expected loss equals your PDs, your LGDs, and your EADs all multiplied. I'm actually going to skip this slide, there's a few errors, but there's one of the things I just want to point out on that last slide that is intended to entail is that, you know, in part of your PD or LGD methodology, you can incorporate as coefficients different either attributes to the loan or economic factors. And by incorporating those within the probability of default and loss given default calculations, it's not necessarily needed to repeat those methodologies or the overlays of those. With probability of default, there's not one right methodology. And so I'm gonna bring to the table just a few methodologies that I've seen in the industry and kind of the strengths and weaknesses of each. The scorecard methodology, this is a methodology that is used by a lot of banks with low defaults. And the reason why is historically, they don't have the data to either statistically calculate it, because without their defaults, they can't get any statistically significant data points to actually calculate a probability of default. And they also typically use proxy data to help them out here. So that's why the scorecard methodology is a strength. The weakness to it though, is that it's extremely hard to support, and it's extremely hard to, you know, I think logically it typically makes sense, but it's extremely challenging to have a backing and historical analysis to support it. So what the scorecard methodology is, if you're not familiar with it, is typically a mix of qualitative and quantitative elements, which have a weighting and a risk factor associated with that. And based on those scorecard elements, there's a probability of default that's assigned. And the reason this is one of the more challenging things to support is because it's the sum of pieces that equal appropriate probability of default, and it's very qualitatively based. An example to dig into it is, you know, one element of the scorecard might be the management ranking, you know, 1 to 6. This 1 to 6 rating given by the criteria that's typically involved in your risk rating scale is then applied to a probability of default, either through statistical analysis of proxy data or your own data if you have, and then the sum of all the elements, which would also take quantitative things like just debt service coverage ratio equals your probability of default. And so it allows judgment and different aspects of the loan to come up with a probability of default. And yet, because of all that, it's very hard to support. On the flip side, your historical default migration table is one of the most supportable by relevant data for probability of default. And this is very similar to your cohort approach, in which instead of going from your cohort position to a loss event, it's tracking one risk rating to another risk rating. And the probability of moving to that different risk rating. Based on that, given where your current risk rating is, you have a probability of default to a loss position. And then statistical methodologies, which, is everyone here familiar with SAS modelers, or some people call them SAS modeling? Okay, so SAS is just a computer statistical program that takes different correlations and there are different data sets and calculates a correlation from them and different models from them. And so at simplest level, SAS can help create these methodologies and these models by looking at all the data your bank has. But that's a highly statistical procedure that typically takes a lot of analysis and a lot of data to get to. Loss given default considerations is almost always looked at from a loan to value perspective, because collateral is the biggest factor as far as loss given default. And there's a couple different considerations that you're probably familiar with. That's cost of foreclosure repossession and cost to sell. That's most likely one of your analysis for impaired loans right now. But then there's also other things that when you're talking about loss given default considerations that should be thought of, and that's variability in assets. This kind of goes back to when I mentioned the asset-light position. If you have an asset-light position, there's probably more variability in asset price. That's something to consider, that when you foreclose, is the collateral still going to be worth what you thought it was. And depreciable assets, depending on your expected, the timing of the expected default assets will depreciate throughout the life. Well, there's a lot to cover in that last section. Are there any questions related to that? Oh, sorry.
Just confirm something if you would, the probability of default is unit-based, right, it's events. Like if you had 100 loans that were all passed and 5 of them defaulted, then it was 5%.
That's correct. The probability of default is unit-based, percentage on the loss given defaults ratio. Do you have a question?
People, well, not really, so you usually keep, for example, what methodology do you use most of for credit? School code, historical?
So with SOP 03-3, it's typically, what I've almost always seen is the historical default migration table, or having a third party, come up with comparable default rates. So, I think when you get into an impaired loan situation, you lose some of the, statistical significance that you get, and it's more on an asset by asset basis. Any other questions? Correlations and adjustment factors.
I had a question, it's actually more on the, talking about the cohorts, and you had them, set up, whatever, risk rating and whatever it was, special mention, blah, blah, blah. Why can't a company or bank just say, okay, here's our total? And, I mean, cause you're gonna do that for all of the different risk rates, right?
Yeah.
And it gets to a final, but then the final just, why wouldn't you use you wouldn't have to segregate them at all, you would just use one, here's the rate for all the loans.
Well, that's a good question, and that may, as far as calculating the allowance, it won't.
I think I know the answer, but I can't.
Because what your portfolio looks like at the end is not what your portfolio looked exactly like when all these other loans were aggregated. So, even as your portfolio deteriorates, then if you're just using one aggregated number, you're not gonna have any adjustment to it. If you have, if the loans migrate to special mention, then the cohort method, there'll be a higher rate applied, and that allowance will be captured. Yes, sir.
Yeah, another thought I have is that it gets back to this whole concentrations issue and changes in concentrations.
Yeah. So
if you always had, let's say special mention was always 10% of your portfolio, you probably could do just what you said, do one big thing. But if at different parts of the business cycle, substandard jumps up to 25–30% of the portfolio, you've got a concentration there that you have to otherwise perhaps capture.
Yeah, you'd have to use a qualitative adjustment, and this breaks it down.
Well, you'd have
this
to have
breaks
an
it down
adjustment,
and
whether it's
justifies a lot
qualitative or
more
not.
what the qualitative adjustments would
Now,
be.
whether it's qualitative or not, I think is up to the bank, but
Yeah.
you would have to have an adjustment for that concentration, just as if over time, your loan portfolio, if the percentage of your commercial loans that was in commercial real estate was bumping up from 5% to 45%, you'd have to say, how do I adjust for that? How do I recognize that? If it was constant 5%, you wouldn't need to.
Right.
Good question. Anything else before we move on? We got about 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna focus on the selection of adjustment factors. This is a quote that I think is fairly relevant, even though the writer of the quote has nothing to do with financial analysis. says the invalid assumption that correlation implies cause is probably among the 2 or 3 most serious common errors of human reasoning. And I kind of say this just from an aspect when you're selecting adjustment factors, there's always the possibility that your selection criteria results in a high correlation. And you know, the biggest advice I can give from my experience is just use your business sense when coming up with adjustment factors. If you can't explain it in plain English to probably even someone not accounting or credit at your bank, it doesn't make sense to use. From my experience in model validation and in my auditing experience, you know, I would be more satisfied with a low correlation, or not low, but lower correlation that we can discuss and makes logical sense, than something that has an extremely high correlation that makes no sense. And just an example of this is, I was working at a client doing a DFAS, and their completely domestic consumer loan portfolio for net charge-offs had a extremely high correlation with the Asian exchange rate, and this wasn't an Asian bank, it had no relation to that, everything was domestic, and so it made absolutely no sense, and the modelers that wanted to proceed forward is using this as the adjustment factors, and we had to take a step back and say, I know all your statistical modeling says this is the highest correlation, but no one could comprehend why or how there's any logic behind that. And so we ended up going with a lower correlated factor that we could explain and make logical sense. Besides that, it's important to determine factors that have historically published data, and make sure that you have this data compared to your factors, and then verify the reliability of future economic forecasts. So there's nothing specific in the proposed CECL model about having to have published data, and even with the DFAST and CCAR modeling that we've seen for expected losses that we've seen, you're actually not required to use the published data, just highly recommended. And the reason I would say go with the published data is if you start building your own forecast, you now have another model to build, another model to validate, and another model to support and answer any questions. The Fed has over 4,400 different economic factors published, and the Department of Labor has additional ones. So there's plenty of data out there that you should be able to find some kind of data that correlates with your portfolio. Then determine statistically significant factors. So there's a huge range here. You can visually inspect your factors by looking at historical losses compared to your lines. You can use Excel to do regression analysis. You can, I guess I referred to SAS modeling a few times. That is a statistical package. They have lower versions of that to help come up with the correlations and assess the strength of those correlations. And once you determine those, take a step back, make sure you can explain the causation in English. So we're gonna move quickly through this, but there's a few things to consider that, economic factors might not have their impact immediately, and in fact, it probably won't have their impact immediately. So economic factors have different timings and different asset classes. And I've even seen this down to pretty granularity, where owner-occupied can have a different impact on the timing between non-owner-occupied CRE for as far as adjustment factors. So there's always a lag that you have to build into your factors. But even with that lag, you have to take the current factor into perspective of forecasting your expected losses. Non-constant coefficients is essentially when the coefficient in your expected loss model changes over time. And then negative coefficients is something like housing price index versus single family loss rates. That's housing price index go up, the single family loss rates go down. So it can still be a strong negative correlation. So this is just something that, from a visual perspective, I wanted to see your thoughts. On the blue line, there's an economic factor, and then on the orange, it's a subsequent charge over subsequent loss. I guess, do you guys see a relationship between the two lines? And is anyone daring enough to try and take a guess at explaining what that relationship is?
It's the same line only inverted.
It's a lagging, negative correlation.
Yep, you guys are both right. So this is actually the exact same lines inverted with a lag of 3. So you guys, come on, that was the exact right answer. And the point I want to show here is, if you're not using really complex statistical software that can automatically tell you that, it's important to just be able to think outside the box, because something like this where there's a direct relationship, if you weren't thinking, if you're just looking for two lines that mirrored each other or follow each other very closely, this is something you would not have noticed. And so keep your eyes open for lags and inverse correlations. Because we're actually a minute over, I'm going to really quickly skip over to transitioning. So the first part about transitioning, it might be a couple years until your model actually goes implemented, but I would say right now, if not a few years ago, was the perfect time to start preparing your data. So granularity increases the options for developing supportable data. Just remember that as going forward. As you're recording your data, the more granular the better. And then saving static pools is something that gives you different options to look back historically. And that was actually a really good question you had earlier. We got to poll everyone on how many people could look back on their migration or their risk rating at a historical point in time, and about half people said you could, and another half said you couldn't. So that might be something you want to consider saving, is static pool information. Separate the default from loss and recovery. In different states, regions, asset classes, that instant of default has a varying degree of timeline between your loss, another varying degree of timeline before your recovery. So saving that granularity of data, especially when you're using a PD/LGD model, helps out. It's very important in all these methods to get a full loan life cycle. It is very important also to get a full business cycle for purposes of adjustment factors. Without a full business cycle, you only went back to 2009, you might be only looking at positive adjustment factors or positive data. And take a special note of policy changes. So, when you go back and look at historical data, it might be worth looking at when the changes occurred in credit policy and see how that might have impacted it, just so you don't have any noise as you're calculating your adjustment factors. Sorry, that was a wrong slide. As far as governance, a few things that are good to do: consider assembling a steering committee. Usually the chief credit officer, the people responsible for the allowance within accounting, some institutions possibly a CFO, other people that understand their lending practices, develop, using that steering committee, develop policies and procedures, develop a plan to implement a CECL model, and then discuss with your auditors and regulators to vet your plan. Also, depending on the way you go, you might want to start considering staff planning and augmentation. Because of DFAS and CCAR, you are going to go a highly statistical methodology. Some of the more quantitative skills are at a premium right now, pretty hard to find. So that might be something you might want to be thinking about earlier than sooner than later. And then model validation. And this is something that is important with every time you have a new updated model that has uncertainty in it. should be performed by independent parties. If you have a model risk management group at your institution, make sure they're qualified to look at a model of this type. If not, it might be worth something to outsource this type of procedure, at least for the first one. To look at least annually at the model, or as required by updates. And out of all the model validation procedures, I just kind of want to point out one that I think in this situation would be especially helpful in understanding weaknesses in the model. And that's to back test the model, including the adjustment factors. By doing that, you'll be able to see, you're essentially taking it through a test run or historical data, and you'll be able to see if the way you're applying adjustment factors and if the way your codes are assigned are reasonable. That's sufficiently document model theory. There's going to be a lot of change for all parties and stakeholders involved, including your regulators and auditors. I think having your understanding of the model and the model theory and the conceptual soundness of that model down on paper is going to get people through it a lot easier. So I think I'm about a few minutes over, so I just want to give some time for questions, and if not, I'll be up to this.
Maybe more question.
Yeah.
If you take the difference in expected credit losses or current estimate of all contractual cash flows not expected to be collected, or a prepayment. You get prepayment, you expect contractual cash flow for about.
Yeah.
So you don't expect anything to be able to expect prepayment.
And that's
So you don't create an allowance for that.
Yeah, you don't create an allowance for this, you're saying the interest not to be collected, right? And I think the way that it's interpreted is that until that interest is accrued, it's not a loss. So if it's a prepayment or if it's, Dorsey, my colleagues in the room, do you have any?
I didn't hear the question.
The question is, they're saying that the definition of expected credit losses is all contractual cash flows not expected to be collected. And that's the definition for the guidance. And you're saying, well, what about in terms of prepayments? And I think my interpretation is that it's not expected to be collected because the interest hasn't been accrued yet during it. So
Right, the prepayments come off the top, if you will. Prepayments come out of the expected cash flows,
Yeah.
not out of the losses.
Well, you're saying the point is that there's still interest that's contractual, so incurred.
The contractual is assuming you keep the loan through the term and you have no prepayments, no losses.
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you that I understand what your question is, but I don't think that's the way it's meant to be
But if it's an
interpreted.
expected cash flow is not expected to be collected, then your prepayments will be taken out.
Yeah, I think the language is not the best,
Yeah.
honestly, or maybe I just don't understand what the FASB wrote, but they take all contractual cash flows and say that's where we start from. But of course, that's not the present value of all contractual cash flows. That's, if I understand it, that's gross contractual cash flows. And then they say the asset would be the present value of the expected cash flows. I think there's something missing there in going from, I mean, assume you did not expect any losses,
Yeah.
But you expect a prepayment.
then what's the difference, the difference between the present value of the expected cash flows and the total contractual cash flows is all of your interest.
Yeah, so you're right about that.
Where does that fit in the FASB model? I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, right, FASB, certainly struggled with that. I mean, basically, you're trying to tell investors, here's what the net present value is going to be, right? That's what
I
the
mean,
net loan balance.
Yeah, that
And
basic model.
saying that
doesn't work.
there's a present value, and yet they also say that loss rates or what have you, that don't necessarily consider, timing, but that's still okay in a present value model. So they actually, this concept of the expected credit losses not to expect to be collected is novel, because it is completely separate from the concept of present value of expected cash flows, right? And so they run into some problems, just like we were talking about in regards to purchase accounting, where you've bought a loan and you've discounted it because of the expected credit loss, and then you record another allowance on top of that. And so even though they're trying to say that the net of those two is a present value, it really isn't. But FASB isn't willing to also reconcile that, and they'll just let it go like that. So at least as it stands right now. But yeah, trying to get some sort of conceptual basis of all that stuff, I think it's just kind of maddening.
Yeah, where we end up with purchase loans, you do a business combination and you purchase loans outright, is you end up with a category of purchase loans for which the immediate allowance provision goes through earnings, and another category of purchase loans through which you get to book that allowance in purchase accounting.
Right.
And the distinction between those two is going to be
a big point of contention.
A big point of contention.
In an audit.
And not necessarily logical, because they're saying you get to book it in purchase accounting if there's been more than insignificant deterioration since the loan was made. So if the loan started at category 1 and deteriorated to category 4, you probably get to book that allowance in purchase accounting, not through P&L. But if you went out and bought a category 4 loan that was originated as a category 4 loan, it hasn't had any deterioration, and therefore you have to book it and then provide the allowance through earnings.
We could have a good couple hours to talk about the
Yeah.
problems we have
It's,
conceptually, but you brought it, absolutely.
It's
a good point.
There are going to be some real brain twisters coming out of this implementation.
So, well, I appreciate the good question, and wait for a good session, so that is the end. Thank you, guys.